Welcome to the Soft Scoop, where the headlines are soft, the stories are slower, and the goal is simple: to help you relax, unwind, and maybe even drift off. Let's catch up, quietly. Tonight we drift through the story of a man who chose a quieter path in a world of power and tradition. A path of humility, service, and questions that gently rattled the rafters of the most ancient institution in the world. Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, passed away in 2025, closing the chapter on a life that quietly transformed the Catholic Church. A pope who washed the feet of prisoners, rode in a used Fiat, and asked simply, "Who am I to judge?" Our story begins in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on December 17, 1936. Jorge Mario was the first of 5 children, born to Italian immigrants who had fled Mussolini's fascism in search of a better life. His father, Mario, was an accountant who had left Italy when the political climate grew dangerous. His mother, Regina, was a homemaker, devoted to raising her children with strong values and quiet faith. Jorge's childhood was modest, but comfortable. Their home in the Flores neighborhood was a place of simple pleasures and deep conversation. From his grandmother, Rosa, he learned the importance of faith woven into daily life. She taught him his first prayers, shared stories of saints, and showed him that spirituality wasn't something reserved for Sundays, but lived in gentle, everyday moments. As a boy, Jorge was curious and thoughtful. He loved science, chemistry, and literature. He often played soccer in the streets with neighborhood children, cheering passionately for San Lorenzo, the team he would support his entire life. He enjoyed tango music, the cultural heartbeat of Argentina, and was known to have a sweet tooth for the dulce de leche that his mother made. But Argentina in the 1940s and 50s was a nation in transition. Jorge came of age during the controversial presidency of Juan Perón, whose populist politics divided the country. These early experiences with political polarization would shape Bergoglio's later approach to conflict, seeking middle ground, dialogue, and the hard work of listening across divides. After graduating from technical school as a chemical technician, young Jorge worked briefly in a laboratory. His path seemed set for a career in science, but at 21, life took an unexpected turn. A serious respiratory infection struck Jorge Mario, forcing him into a hospital bed where he hovered between life and death. Surgeons had to remove part of his right lung. During his long recovery, something profound shifted in his perspective. Faced with his own fragility, he found himself drawn not to power or success, but to something deeper. He would later recall this moment as pivotal. When you're lying in a hospital bed, thinking you might die, you see life differently. You understand that control is an illusion. What matters is presence, service, love. Not long after his recovery, on March 11, 1958, he entered the novitiate of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. This choice would define his entire philosophy. The Jesuits are known for their intellectual rigor, their missionary work, and their vow of special obedience to the Pope. But what drew Jorge most was their commitment to education, humility, and service, especially to the poor. The Jesuit formation is notoriously demanding. For 11 years, Bergoglio studied philosophy, theology, literature, and psychology. He taught at Jesuit schools, learned to speak multiple languages, and deepened his spiritual practice. These years shaped his analytical mind and his approach to problems, careful, thorough, and always considering multiple perspectives. By 1969, Bergoglio was ordained a priest. He rose quickly through the ranks of the Jesuits, becoming novice master at the seminary of San Miguel, where he taught theology. By 1973, at just 36 years old, he was named Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in Argentina, a position of significant responsibility and influence. But this rapid ascent coincided with one of the darkest chapters in Argentina's history, the period known as the Dirty War. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina was ruled by a military junta that waged a campaign of state terrorism against supposed left-wing threats. Between 10,000 and 30,000 people disappeared, kidnapped, tortured, and killed by government forces. Many were students, intellectuals, trade unionists, and activists. Father Bergoglio's role during this time remains a source of heated debate among historians and Argentinians. Critics claim he didn't do enough to publicly denounce the regime, or protect Jesuit priests working in poor communities who were targeted by the government. 2 Jesuit priests who worked in the slums were kidnapped and tortured in 1976, and questions lingered about whether Bergoglio could have done more to protect them. Journalist Horacio Verbitsky accused Bergoglio of effectively betraying these priests by withdrawing his protection after they refused to stop their work in the slums. Though the priests themselves later defended him, this controversy would follow Bergoglio throughout his career and into his papacy, with some human rights activists in Argentina still questioning his courage during this critical period. Others maintained that Bergoglio worked quietly behind the scenes to secure their freedom, hiding people in his car, smuggling others out of the country with falsified passports, and using his connections to advocate for the disappeared. This approach, quiet diplomacy rather than public confrontation, would become characteristic of his leadership style, drawing both praise for its effectiveness and criticism for its lack of prophetic witness. What's clear is that this era left him deeply cautious of authoritarianism and more committed than ever to the quiet power of presence. It also taught him about the complexities of navigating institutions with compromised moral authority, a lesson that would serve him decades later when addressing the Church's own failings. After his time as provincial ended, Bergoglio continued his work in education. He completed his doctoral dissertation in Germany, served as a confessor and spiritual director, and eventually became rector of the Philosophical and Theological Faculty of San Miguel. In 1992, Pope John Paul II named him Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires. By 1998, he was made Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and in 2001, he was elevated to Cardinal by Pope John Paul II. As Cardinal Bergoglio, he maintained a distinctly humble lifestyle that foreshadowed his papal approach. He lived in a simple apartment rather than the ornate archbishop's residence, cooked his own meals, and rode public transportation instead of using a chauffeur. He was known for his work in the villas miserias, the slums of Buenos Aires, where he established new parishes, sent priests to live and work among the poor, and personally visited to listen to their struggles. One priest who worked with him remembered, "He would come without announcement, walking through the mud in his worn shoes. He didn't make speeches, he sat with people, he listened, he asked questions, and people felt seen." In February 2013, Pope Benedict XVI shocked the world by announcing his resignation due to advancing age and declining health, the first papal resignation in nearly 600 years. Cardinals from around the world gathered in Rome for the conclave to elect a new pope. Few considered Cardinal Bergoglio a front-runner. At 76, he was older than ideal for a new pope. He came from Latin America, never having served in the Roman Curia, and his quiet demeanor didn't mark him as someone seeking the position. But on March 13, 2013, white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel. Jorge Mario Bergoglio had been elected the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church, the first from the Americas, the first Jesuit, and the first to take the name Francis. His choice of name was immediately symbolic. Saint Francis of Assisi was known for his radical embrace of poverty, his love for the natural world, and his work for peace. By choosing this name, the new pope was signaling his priorities. When he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to address the crowd for the first time, Pope Francis broke with tradition immediately. Instead of blessing the people first, he asked them to pray for him. He bowed his head in silence, a gesture of humility that set the tone for what was to come. From day one, Pope Francis signaled that this papacy would be different. He declined the luxurious papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace, choosing instead to live in the modest Vatican guest house, Santa Marta. He wore simple white vestments without the ornate gold and red capes of his predecessors. He carried his own briefcase, paid his own hotel bill, and made phone calls to ordinary people who had written to him. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they reflected a fundamental belief that the Church had become too insular, too focused on its own power and prestige, and too distant from the people it was meant to serve. In his first major document, Evangelii Gaudium, The Joy of the Gospel, Francis wrote, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security." This vision extended to his public appearances. Where previous popes had been formal and distant, Francis was warm and spontaneous. He embraced people with physical disabilities that some might find uncomfortable. He invited homeless people to his birthday celebrations. He took selfies with young pilgrims and accepted their gifts of mate tea from Argentina. In July 2013, he made his first trip outside Rome to Lampedusa, a tiny Italian island that had become the first port of call for many migrants from North Africa seeking entry to Europe. There, he threw a wreath into the sea to commemorate the thousands who had drowned trying to reach safety, and he condemned what he called the globalization of indifference to human suffering. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Francis's early papacy was his willingness to break with ceremonial traditions that had stood for centuries. On Holy Thursday 2013, just weeks after his election, he traveled to a juvenile detention center in Rome for the traditional foot-washing ceremony that commemorates Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. Previous popes had performed this ritual with priests or carefully selected Catholic men. Francis knelt before young inmates, including women and Muslims, washing, drying, and kissing their feet. He would continue this practice throughout his papacy, washing the feet of refugees, prisoners, and people with disabilities. Each time the message was the same: no one is beyond dignity, no one is beyond service, no one is beyond love. In 2015, Pope Francis released perhaps his most influential document, Laudato Si', Praise Be to You, the first papal encyclical focused entirely on the environment. In it, he addressed not just Catholics, but every person living on this planet, framing climate change as a moral and spiritual crisis that disproportionately affects the poor. He wrote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." He critiqued consumerism, called for sustainable development, and linked care for the environment with care for human dignity. The document was praised by environmental scientists and activists worldwide, while drawing criticism from industries reliant on fossil fuels. This environmental focus troubled some conservative Catholics who felt the Pope was straying into politics, rather than focusing on spiritual matters. American Cardinal Raymond Burke remarked that the Church is not called to be a political agent working on policies. Others questioned the scientific basis for climate change concerns, suggesting the Pope had been unduly influenced by secular environmentalists. That same year, Francis visited the United States, becoming the first Pope to address a joint session of Congress. Speaking to American lawmakers, he highlighted the lives of 4 Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton, strategically chosen to emphasize themes of freedom, equality, social justice, and spiritual depth. Throughout his papacy, Francis showed a remarkable ability to speak to people beyond the Catholic faith. His approachable style and focus on universal human concerns earned him respect from many who disagreed with Catholic doctrine. He held interfaith services with Jewish, Muslim, and Buddhist leaders. He visited synagogues, mosques, and the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Yet these interfaith efforts sometimes faced criticism for being more symbolic than substantive. His historic visit to Iraq in 2021, the first papal visit to the country, created powerful images but left some questioning whether it would lead to lasting improvements for persecuted Christian communities there. Similarly, his meetings with Muslim leaders, while groundbreaking, did little to address the deep theological differences that divide the faiths or the persecution of Christians in some Muslim-majority countries. But perhaps the most quoted moment of Francis's papacy came during an impromptu press conference on a flight back from Brazil in 2013. When asked about gay priests, he responded, "If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge?" Those 5 words, "Who am I to judge?" reverberated around the world. They didn't change official church teaching on homosexuality, but they represented a striking shift in tone and emphasis. Where previous papal statements had focused on doctrinal condemnation, Francis emphasized personal discernment and mercy. This approach, focusing on pastoral care rather than doctrinal purity, would characterize his approach to many controversial issues. He spoke of the Church as a field hospital after battle, more concerned with healing wounds than enforcing rules. In his 2016 apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, he opened possibilities for divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion in certain circumstances, emphasizing discernment over rigid application of rules. This document sparked significant debate within the Church, with some traditionalists accusing Francis of undermining Catholic teaching on marriage. For LGBTQ+ Catholics, Francis's papacy was a study in mixed signals. While his "Who am I to judge" comment created hope, the Church under his leadership continued to oppose same-sex marriage and maintained that homosexual acts were intrinsically disordered. A 2021 Vatican decree reiterated that the Church could not bless same-sex unions because God cannot bless sin. though this position was partially modified in late 2023 when the Vatican approved limited blessings for same-sex couples that would not resemble marriage ceremonies. This half-step approach left many LGBTQ+ Catholics feeling perpetually in limbo, appreciated as people but told their relationships remain problematic. As one gay Catholic activist put it, it's like being invited to dinner but not allowed to eat. Francis's papacy was defined not just by what he did, but by what he didn't do, particularly regarding women's roles in the Church. Though he appointed more women to Vatican positions than any previous pope and created a commission to study the possibility of women deacons, he maintained the Church's position that priestly ordination is reserved for men. In a 2020 documentary, he expressed support for civil union laws to protect same-sex couples, saying, "They're children of God and have a right to a family," while simultaneously reaffirming the Church's teaching that marriage is between a man and a woman. This attempt to navigate a middle path often left both traditionalists and progressives dissatisfied. Perhaps the most difficult challenge of Francis's papacy was addressing the Church's sexual abuse crisis. While he established new procedures for accountability, created a pontifical commission for the protection of minors, and defrocked several high-ranking clergy members accused of abuse or cover-ups, critics argued his response was too slow and too protective of the institution. In 2018, a Pennsylvania grand jury report detailed decades of abuse and cover-ups, and Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, a prominent American cardinal, was revealed to have abused minors and seminarians for decades. Francis faced criticism for not acting more quickly in response to information about McCarrick. Even more damaging was his handling of abuse cases in Chile. In 2018, Francis strongly defended Bishop Juan Barros, who had been accused of covering up abuse by a notorious predator priest, Fernando Caradima. Francis dismissed the accusations as slander and claimed there was not one piece of evidence against Barros. When confronted by reporters, he responded sharply, "The day they bring me proof against Bishop Barros, then I will speak. There is not one single piece of evidence against him. It is calumny." This response caused outrage among survivors. Later, after receiving a 2,300-page report on the situation, Francis admitted he had made serious errors of judgment and had been misinformed. He summoned all of Chile's bishops to Rome and eventually accepted the resignations of several, including Barros. While this showed a willingness to correct course, the damage to survivors and to Francis's credibility on abuse issues was significant. In 2019, he convened an unprecedented summit on abuse with bishops from around the world. But many survivor advocates felt the concrete actions that followed were insufficient. As one survivor group put it, families have been destroyed, lives lost to addiction and suicide, and children traumatized because the Church has been more concerned with protecting itself than protecting the innocent. The Vatican's financial situation also posed significant challenges during Francis's papacy. He inherited an institution plagued by corruption, money laundering allegations, and lack of transparency. While he instituted reforms and created new oversight mechanisms, financial scandals continued to emerge. In 2019, Vatican police raided the offices of the Secretariat of State and the Financial Information Authority as part of an investigation into questionable real estate investments, including the purchase of a luxury building in London that allegedly involved millions in broker fees to middlemen. In 2021, Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Becciu was charged with embezzlement and abuse of office in connection with these dealings, the first cardinal to stand trial in the Vatican's criminal court in modern times. While Francis was not personally implicated in these scandals, critics argued that the persistence of corruption showed the limits of his reform efforts. The Vatican's financial problems were structural and cultural, requiring more than just new rules or oversight committees. Despite these challenges, Francis maintained an ambitious schedule of diplomatic engagement. He mediated between the United States and Cuba, helping to thaw relations between the longtime adversaries. He made historic visits to Iraq, Myanmar, and the United Arab Emirates, always emphasizing dialogue over conflict. As war raged in Ukraine following Russia's invasion, Francis made repeated appeals for peace, though his efforts to maintain diplomatic relationships with both sides sometimes drew criticism. His reluctance to explicitly condemn Russia as the aggressor frustrated many Ukrainians who felt the Pope was engaging in a misguided neutrality in the face of clear aggression. Similarly, his calls for ceasefire and humanitarian aid in Gaza positioned him as a voice for peace amid intense geopolitical conflict, though some felt his statements lacked the moral clarity the situation demanded. Throughout these diplomatic efforts, Francis consistently centered the human cost of war, violence, and political brinkmanship. In his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti, All Brothers, he wrote passionately against nationalism, individualism, and the throwaway culture that discards both people and goods. He advocated for migrants, refugees, and the economically marginalized, framing their care as non-negotiable for anyone who claims to value human dignity. Francis's health began to decline noticeably in his later years. The partial lung removal from his youth left him vulnerable to respiratory issues. He underwent colon surgery in 2021 and suffered from knee problems that often forced him to use a wheelchair. Yet, he maintained a grueling schedule of public appearances, international travel, and administrative duties well into his 80s. As his strength waned, Francis spoke often about aging, fragility, and preparing for death. In a 2021 interview, he reflected, "Old age is the phase in life most apt for disseminating the joyful news that life is the initiation to a final fulfillment. The elderly walk towards the horizon, towards heaven, which opens up to a joy that no one will be able to take from them." In his final public appearances, Francis emphasized the themes that had defined his papacy: mercy over judgment, service over power, dialogue over condemnation, and care for the poor and the planet over institutional preservation. When Pope Francis passed away peacefully in his sleep in early 2025, at the age of 88, the world mourned a leader who had challenged both his church and the broader global community to greater compassion, greater awareness, and greater responsibility. By the time of his death, Francis had become the most traveled pope in history, visiting 60 countries across all inhabited continents. He was the first pope to speak before the U.S. Congress, the first to visit the Arabian Peninsula, and the only one in modern times to make poverty, climate change, and inclusion central to the Church's mission. His funeral drew leaders from across religious and political spectrums, many of whom had disagreed with him, but all of whom recognized his authentic commitment to building bridges and serving others. In the years since Francis's passing, historians and theologians have begun the work of assessing his legacy. What seems clear is that his impact extended far beyond doctrinal changes or administrative reforms. Francis changed the conversation about what religious leadership could look like in the 21st century. He demonstrated that humility is not weakness, but strength of a different kind. He showed that institutions can be servants rather than masters. He proved that powerful messages can be delivered in gentle ways. And he reminded a world obsessed with winning that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to walk alongside the lost, the last, and the least. Francis was not without contradictions and limitations. He championed decentralization of church authority while maintaining a distinctly personal and direct leadership style. He called for dialogue while sometimes responding sharply to his critics. He emphasized mercy while occasionally displaying flashes of the stern Jesuit superior he had once been. His promise of zero tolerance for abusers sometimes faltered in practice. His openings toward LGBTQ+ Catholics and divorced and remarried Catholics created hope, but stopped short of fundamental change. His appointments of women to Vatican positions were significant, but did not challenge the male-only priesthood. His financial reforms improved transparency, but couldn't entirely uproot entrenched corruption. But these contradictions made him authentically human in a role often shrouded in distance and formality. Francis never claimed perfection. He went to confession regularly. He asked for prayers. He admitted mistakes. In doing so, he made the papacy more accessible and more relatable than it had been for centuries. Looking back, what stands out most about Pope Francis's life is not any single policy or pronouncement, but the consistent way he embodied his message. He didn't just talk about simplicity. He lived in a modest apartment. He didn't just preach about serving the poor. He invited them to meals. He didn't just write about environmental stewardship. He installed solar panels at the Vatican and banned plastic. In a world where leaders often say one thing and do another, Francis's authenticity was his most powerful credential. This consistency between word and deed gave weight to his message, even among those who disagreed with him. It allowed him to challenge systems of power while working within them, and it gave hope to millions that institutions could change, that tradition could breathe, that faith could be both ancient and new. One story perhaps best captures the essence of Francis's approach. During a general audience in St. Peter's Square, A small boy escaped from his mother and ran onto the stage where Francis was speaking. Security guards moved to intercept him, but Francis waved them away. The boy explored the stage, even sitting in the papal chair while Francis continued his address. Eventually, the child hugged Francis's legs and wouldn't let go. Rather than sending him back to his mother, Francis invited the boy to stay beside him. When officials tried to lure the child away with candy, Francis leaned down and whispered something in his ear. The boy nodded and returned to his seat. When asked later what he had said to the child, Francis replied simply, "I told him I needed to talk to his brothers and sisters and asked if he would let me do that. He said yes and went back to his seat." Children have much to teach us about trust and freedom. This small moment encapsulated Francis's pontificate: informal, unscripted, prioritizing relationship over protocol, seeing interruptions as opportunities rather than problems, and finding wisdom in unexpected places. Perhaps this is why, despite his controversies and limitations, Francis remains a figure of fascination and admiration, even among those who disagreed with him. In a polarized world, he attempted, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to build bridges rather than walls. He recognized the humanity in everyone he met, from presidents to prisoners, and he showed that even ancient institutions can evolve, not by dramatic rupture, but by gentle, persistent pressure and presence. Tonight, we say goodbye to Pope Francis, a man who didn't want a legacy, only a conversation. A man who reminded us that power doesn't have to shout, it can whisper, it can serve, it can walk alongside the poor and speak gently into the noise of the world. A man who, even in the highest halls of religion, still chose the path of the humble priest from Buenos Aires. A man whose life was marked by both profound wisdom and human limitations, by both courage and caution, by both revolutionary vision and institutional constraints. As we drift toward sleep, perhaps we might ask ourselves, what would our world look like if more leaders chose Francis's path? If they prioritized presence over pronouncements, listening over lecturing, mercy over judgment, what would our own lives look like if we did the same? Rated 2 yawns out of 5, because while this one's sleepy, it's also a little stirring. Sleep well, the world can wait.